Hi, everybody. Welcome to another wonderful Friday Night Fright with Scuppernong Books, part of our Halloween horror series we have going on here at the bookstore. I am Shannon Jones. I am a writer of queer sci-fi and fantasy, and also a co-owner here at Scuppernong Books. And we are so thrilled tonight to have two amazing genre with us this evening. We are being joined tonight by Ryan La Sala, who is coming to us from New York City. He writes about surreal things happening to queer people and is the author of Reverie, The Honeys, and Bedazzled, in addition to his brand new novel, Beholder. And Naben Ruthnum is coming to us from Vancouver, is actually a writer out of Toronto, Ontario. His most recent works are the novel A Hero of Our Time and the horror novella Help Meet. And he's also written thrillers under the name Nathan Ripley and is coming to talk about his first YA horror novel tonight, The Grimmer. So welcome, Ryan and Naben. It's really nice to have you.
It's Naben.
Naben, I'm sorry.
Thank you for having us.
No problem.
Naben, I apologize.
Yeah, but thanks for having us. Yeah, really happy to be here.
So first, I would really like to just start off by having you both tell us a little bit about your newest books that you have out. And if you could just give us a sense of kind of what the 30-second pitch is on both of your great novels, Beholder and The Grimmer.
Good. Sure. So I'll start with Beholder. Beholder is, it just came out 2 weeks ago, so I'm not used to talking about it yet, but it's about a kid who is attending a party that he shouldn't be at in New York City, and he ends up being the sole survivor of this cataclysmic event that turns his world upside down. And so in order to avoid being pinned with the blame, he's got to engage with this ancient curse that has been on his family for, according to his grandmother, his yaya, he's Greek, centuries and centuries, in which if he looks into a mirror, he can rewind that mirror and see everything the mirror has seen, but every time he does it, something in the mirror realm draws closer. And his yaya says it's been stalking his family since, eons past, and it's killed everyone but them. And now this kid basically has to outwit that thing while solving the crime that he's about to be blamed with. So it's about art and obsession in New York City, and sort of what's going on behind the walls around us.
Very cool. I'm already just like
The Grimmer is set in a place that's kind of the opposite of New York City. It's Kelowna, BC, like a really small city that our main character Vish Mori is just like really eager to escape, and he's a huge reader, and he sort of falls in with the staff at this really strange used bookstore in his small town, including like an older figure who's like one of the only other South Asian guys in town, but who's clearly somebody who drinks too much, who's not the typical kind of good influence that you'd want around a 15-year-old. But he quickly realizes that this bookstore in the city is sort of the locus and of a supernatural happening. And there's this creature called Mr. Ferris, who's sort of a walking filing cabinet full of ghosts and demons collected over 2,000 years that are going to be resurrected if he has his way. And our young protagonist, Vish Mori, has to sort of band together with some real weirdos in order to stop that from happening.
I love that.
I would say, I love it when we get really good books for conversations. It's so great. Now, so despite the fact that the two settings are obviously very, very different in both of your novels, like the setting is clearly very important, both the place, but also the time in which, the book is being written. So how did you both kind of settle on where and when exactly you wanted these stories to take place? I say either one of you. I say, Naben, do you want to jump in first since Ryan went first last time?
Sure. All right. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of writers who start writing for young readers end up talking a little bit too much about their own youth. So I was being really careful not to do that. But I will say I did grow up in Kelowna, BC in the 90s, where and when this book is set. And to me, I kind of sort of literature for young readers from across the decades. Like I really wanted it to be a book that is about discovering reading at that age and just using horror especially to sort of push the boundaries of the really small world that you live in. And I thought, what really small worlds do I know best? And it was definitely the small place where I grew up that I really wanted to escape.
Ooh, I love that. So I didn't grow up in New York City. It's where I live now. And I'm sort of one of those people who kind of consistently is writing about things that are happening to them. And I picked New York because a lot of Beholder has to do with how our perceptions form our reality, and how if we can get people to see us a certain way, we can sort of control their reality in a sense too. New York is one of those places where if you're dressed a certain way or you're acting a certain way, it sort of makes all the difference, and you can really be anybody here. And so I wanted to write about these two kids that have to solve this mystery that's in the high art world of New York. And in order to do that, they have to kind of access it. But luckily, they're in a place where appearances matter such a great deal that if they're wearing the right clothes, they can get access to the right places. If they act, entitled enough, people are just going to buy it, because really, in New York, it's such a melting pot that like you can be on the subway side by side with a billionaire, and on the other side is a starving artist, and you just really never know. You can never make these assumptions, and so you sort of afford people this delusion that's kind of contagious. And so I just love that, and I love that New York is a place that has all of these like small enclaves and secrets. And walking around the city, I see all these small hidden doors and walls, and I've gone through some of those doors, and sometimes they lead to just these like vast palatial interiors that you would never know from the outside, because again, appearances matter, but they can be so deceiving in a city like this. And I love the automatic surreality of living in a world that is both so vast but so like personal.
Where did you grow up? Are you from like a small place or a big place?
I'm from like a suburb in Connecticut, like a very sort of Stepfordian situation. And so I grew up kind of coming to New York and always hated it, because coming to like the big city was like, it just felt like tedium, but like through architecture, right? Like all the walking and the crowds and things like that too. And it wasn't until I moved here, which was during COVID, that I totally had to kind of like readjust my relationship with it. And now I really like it. But I had a year here during COVID when the city was like totally vacant, and it was like living in this like film set basically, which is also not a typical experience. So I've had sort of a few different versions of the city, and but the result is that I now, in writing about it, I feel like I have a kind of like 360 view of it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That is super cool. And it actually brings me to something I wanted to ask you about. Both of your books, and you've talked a little bit, in your synopses about the main characters of both of your novels, Athen and Bish. Both of your novels is really interesting, despite being very different from each other on the surface. They both feature main characters who are either like framed for a crime they didn't commit, or like mistaken for someone else that's tangled up in like what is it about this almost structure of like guilty until proven innocent that appeals to you, like in a creepy story like this, where you're trying to get build that momentum and anticipation? What was it about the whole like, oh, you're a part of this whether you want to be or not, guilty until proven innocent thing for your main character?
I think for me, like it was a collision of the young adult and the horror thing, because when you're young, I feel a lot of young people just completely feel like imposters, and that they are being mistaken for someone else, and that their real self, where it comes through, is never expressed. So there's almost this wish to be like, I wish that somebody could either see me for how I really am, or see me for something that I think is more interesting than I really am. And like I built some layers into that in the Grimmer, and like that I think he's seen a number of different ways, some of which are good, some of which are bad, but all of which end up leading to him sort of finding a way to sort of express what he actually is, and sort of use that to make a small impact on the world, even if it's not the kind of typical heroic impact that he might have wanted to step into. But yeah, I think it really comes down to the idea that we all feel like liars, and sometimes having a lie imposed on you makes you get closer to the truth.
I love that. And as you're talking, I'm like, oh yeah, like that could work for me too. But I feel like my answer is so much less artistic. But in my life, I because like Beholder has a lot to do with this like sense, well, it has a lot to do with like my OCD, to be frank, and the sense that like the world, don't worry, I'm like not like this anymore, but growing up I sort of had this like pervaded sense that like if I did something wrong, or like I wasn't, you know, completely honest, even if no one was there, someone would know. God would know, the evil eye would see it, everyone would find out about it. And it was the sense that like, oh my God, like I'm going to be blamed for it. And then I started to kind of even internalize like, oh, if I'm not like super careful, like even things that I haven't done, I'm going to be blamed for, right? Because that's how mental illness works, right? And so I remember the very first moment that I sort of had with Beholder when I was imagining it, it was because I was in this penthouse in New York at this party that I really had no business being at. And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, like all these people here like know each other. If something horrific were to happen, like the likelihood that these people would all band together in like one mass alibi and put the blame on me, 100%. Which like isn't even necessarily true. It was just what I was thinking about in the moment, because I was thinking about The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the story about a woman who's driven insane by the wallpaper, and other things. That's a kind of rude abridgment of that story, but this house had a lot of bad wallpaper in it. And so I was thinking, oh, what if everyone was sort of driven to the brink of their own sanity? What if something happened? What if I was blamed for it? And so I sort of play these torturous thought experiments in my head often. And that's where the very first scene in the book comes from. The very first line of Beholder is something like, the Sunday night at the party at the penthouse, a few hours before everyone dies, a girl with bleached blonde bangs is telling you about her future, which she is obviously wrong about, or something like that. Because I wanted to sort of start it off with this sense of foreboding, like something bad is about to happen to these people or this person. And from a craft level, when you're writing horror and thrillers, it's good to have a ticking clock, something that drives the character onto the next thing for their own sake.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. And you actually answered another question that I was going to ask. So I am going to give Naben a chance to answer, and you can expound on yours too if you want. I don't know, I found, and I know a lot of other writers I've talked to find that, you know, most novels have a kind of like aha moment early on, and it's not necessarily always what you think it's going to be, but there's like a character or a scene or something that just grabs you as a writer, and you're like, oh, that's the story. And I was just curious, like, kind of, did you have any of those moments with your most recent novels, and what was it that moment that you're like, oh, that's the story, that's the thing I'm really telling?
I do have one, but I'm gonna have to figure out another one because it really has a lot to do with like the last twist of the ending.
Okay, no, fair. We won't ask you to divulge that then.
But there were a lot of others. Another big part, which, you know, it's odd. People who've read this and me, when I'm talking about it, I never talk about one of its, you know, main selling features, which is that it's very cat centric. Like there's a lot of cats in this book that have a lot to do with like the magic and witchery and sadness of it. And it's because, you know, I put my actual real cat buddy who died like right before the pandemic in this, and I was absurdly attached to that animal. So it was very unhappy for me to lose him. So I wanted to sort of trace I wanted to like resurrect the cat, basically. That was big for me. So like a lot of the scenes that you'll see with like cats doing something cool, those are things that I was just like, you know, in like a big depression, staring at the wall. I was conjuring these images, and I was like, I gotta find a story to hang.
I love that. Oh,
Thank you.
Kind of gets to live on.
I'm like
now.
looking at my cat now too, by the way. She might come. You want to come here? You want to come say hello? We're talking about cats. Come here. Come here.
Very good.
Oh, that's really sweet though.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, it's the truth. There we go.
No, it just shows inspiration can come from anywhere, and often the best places, because who's not, you know, who doesn't love a good cat story? And that is a good selling point. You should actually start, you know, repping that ahead for all the cat lovers of the world, because I definitely have a few friends that like maybe not pick it up just on that basis, but like if they're looking for a horror read anyway, it is certainly not hurting your chances of them picking up your book.
Come here. Come here. Come say hi.
Are we gonna get to meet the cat? All right, fantastic.
Maybe. We'll see. She's like knows that I'm trying to get her to perform, and she's not that kind of girl.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
She's a
fair.
cat, as it turns out. Yeah.
As thinking about the of horror specifically, something I think is really cool is that both of your books deal with like those timeless teenage feelings of like longing to be a part of the world around you, but at the same time wanting to pull back and run from everyone and everything. How did you, I guess,
Mhm.
draw those parallels between like the teenage experience and almost like the same experience when either reading or watching horror of, do I go further past the closed door? Do I pull back? Those things just pair so well to me. And I wonder, did you think about that at all while you were writing? Was that part of like how you thought about developing your teenage characters alongside of this horror plot?
I mean,
That's
oh,
Go ahead,
okay.
please.
I don't know. I mean, I thought a lot about, so I typically write for my past novels, if anyone's ever read them, they'll sort of sense a similar metal at the heart of the three kids that sort of lead those books, where it's like a queer kid and they've got their shit together, and like they're really trying to do something and accomplish something, and they don't care if people don't like them in the process. And so when I was designing Ethan, who's the main character, Beholder, I wanted to kind of take the approach of like, who's the opposite to that, right? Like, I don't want this like sort of dark nerdy kid that knows exactly what they're doing. I kind of want this like bright charismatic boy that has constructed a version of himself that he feels like is appealing to people, and it's worked. He's gotten, through life basically on like charisma and good looks and flirtation. But it is an artifice. It's sort of a face that he wears. And I then had to kind of ask, well, why? Why would a person do that? And at the same time, I didn't really, for the last question, we're talking about like the moment that things click together. I had a bunch of different ideas that I wanted to work with. And it was when I sort of thought of Ethan as a main character that a few other things sort of lined themselves up and like joined together suddenly. And like that created the book. But I had this like really charismatic kid at the heart of it. And I had, this sense of wallpaper and, our interiors attacking us, because this is during COVID and I was trapped inside and I was very skeptical about all the things around me. But I also had to make sense of why he was like this. And it just reminded me of a lot of people in my teenage years, myself included, that sort of decided, I'm going to be this type of person who's going to have this type of life. Because if I'm this type of person, if I can execute this act in such a flawless way, these things will happen for me. And we kind of call this manifesting now, but for a lot of people, especially like kids like Ethan, it's all about like, if I'm a good enough person, bad things can't happen to me. If I am pure enough, if I am following the rules to such a high degree, like I will have outsmarted this sort of senseless doom that seems to be, snatching people right and left. And so being a teen is sort of when you start to decide that, right? Like who you're going to be, what your life is going to mean, you start kind of asking yourself those big questions. And it's when you start trying on a different persona or personalities to kind of see what fits or what feels right. But a lot of that is performance. And so I wanted to write a kid that is sort of trapped in that performance. And then I wanted to pair him with a kid that sees through it completely. So that's kind of where the fun of that dynamic came from with I don't know if anyone's heard Beholder, but Dom and Ethan are very opposite when it comes to that. And that was why.
Very cool.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't improve on that as well. Obviously, that was very specific to your book, but I feel like a lot of that speaks to what I was going for and like what was sort of in my mind building those characters. I guess I'd add also that my character, and me to a degree, even though my character had a much harder life and teen years than I did, he mostly associates fear with the sense of powerlessness in his own family and powerless over his own life. And I feel like this is where it kind of allies with why people are attracted to horror, I think. That sense of confronting horror in the sort of Lovecraftian sense, or it becomes a very personal kind of fear. And the things you're seeing, especially if nobody else happens to be seeing them, they belong to you. So it's kind of a way that he takes possession over the outside world, is by entering this world of horror that he could never make sense of to his family, like that nobody else can know about except for these new people that he meets through this horror. So it becomes a sort of new way of accessing the world and a new way of being in the world. And the horror kind of helps him to become, if not more of an adult, more of the version of himself that gives him an idea that someday he'll be able to control his destiny and what he does the next day.
I love that.
I love that too. Also, Ryan, I wanted to tell you, I love that one of your characters' names was Dom, because that is actually my son's name. So I was like, oh,
Really?
yay. Yeah. When I saw that, looking at the book, I was just like, oh, yay. Huh. I love anytime.
Is
I
it
see
short
that
for
name.
anything?
Dominic.
Dominic. How's it spelled?
Dominic. Is how
Okay. I
it's
think
spelled.
my Dom has a K at the end. I stole my friend's name for this.
I love that. And Ben, I just want to go back to something you were just saying, because it is something I'm very interested in, and that is, as we're kind of expanding, the types of stories being told, across within YA, but just within all kinds of different genres of publishing and literature. To say, why do you think people from traditionally marginalized communities are so drawn to telling our stories through horror, whether that be, through the lens of race, through the lens of sexuality, gender identity? I know, we've seen with films like Get Out and, all these, like, why do you think people from traditionally marginalized viewpoints are so drawn to telling our stories in this particular fashion?
I don't know if they're any more drawn than people who are not from marginalized identities, but we're seeing much more of it because finally there's a realization that there's like a very different way to approach horror, and it's not like for like every brown guy is going to be a genius horror writer just because it's like something we've never seen before, but there is a chance that you'll get an angle on something familiar that is an unfamiliar angle. And I don't know if like I always consider myself, like, as a reader, I've never felt alienated by, for example, reading like straight white men. Like, to me, like when I'm reading, one of my favorite writers is Joseph Conrad, who's like Captain Colonialism, but he's also like a Polish man who learned English as his third language and who like traveled the world and had all these different experiences. And most importantly, though, when I'm reading those books, when I've finished reading them, they belong to me. Like I really felt like, it's I absorb these things, and like the influences on the Grimmer are writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Sean Bellairs, like extremely white bread and in some cases extremely racist writers. But the act of sort of absorbing the way that they looked at fear and horror and storytelling and putting that through my lens and like my life, I think that's something that's exciting. And I guess, there are terms like reclamation and decolonization, all these that might be useful here, but I think it's just like in a mischievous and interesting way, like kind of neat for writers of color and diverse writers to sort of take all of these things that we've gathered over the years and make them entirely ours through our own stories.
Love that.
Totally.
You also are welcome to answer that question. It's open to
Sure.
basically all questions I'm presenting here are open to anyone who wants to.
I mean, I totally agree. I think that it's it is a good question, but it is a question that like I get often, and I have a few different answers for it, but fundamentally, yeah, it's like, well, now people are paying attention, but often these are stories that we've been telling each other for a really long time. I will say, I think that there's something really masterful at the heart of queer horror specifically. And I don't say this in any way to kind of like diminish the accomplishments of other types of horror, but I know that with the queer horror that I read, a lot of it has a really astute dissection of monstrosity, because a lot of us have been that monster to other people and have had to have a really clear idea of what people find disgusting, corruptive, perverted, right? Because these are the things that have been hoisted specifically on like queer kids. I found out that I was queer by other people shunning me, by being disinvited to things, by adults taking care to make sure that I was safe, which of course puts a mark on a kid's back at the same time, right? And like, I found out I was queer because suddenly I was the monster in the room. And so when I sit down to write a queer horror novel, I'm thinking about that monster. I'm thinking about their perspective. The monster in Beholder has a point of view. It is every other chapter is led by the monster sort of writing to Ethan, the main character, through the second person, which was an artistic choice that I was like, some people are going to really like this and some people are really going to hate it. And I don't think every monster needs a point of view. It's a, you know, you can have things that are just bad and just horrific, and they don't necessarily need to be vindicated at like the level of like a villain, right? But I do think for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about what that monster's thinking and why they're doing it. And I think that it makes whatever hunger that monster's feeling maybe have a little bit more profundity for the reader reading it, even if they don't realize it.
That is just amazing.
Not to bore
I'm sorry,
everyone.
go ahead.
Not to bore everyone to death, but just like really quickly, I also think queer horror like has been so dominant since the early 20th century. This is why it's going to be boring. I wrote my master's thesis on Oscar Wilde's influence on the early English ghost story in the early 20th century.
That's cool.
It's really like after the trials of Oscar Wilde, so many of the queer male writers who wrote aesthetic and decadent literature, they started writing ghost and horror stories. Like they really made like a turn in their work, and so many of those stories are stories of frustrated queer desire, but through this weird lens of like apparitions or like scary things that force men to spend time in like a room together overnight. Like there's all these really like delicate and interesting and amazing horror stories that are just fundamental to everything we think of as horror. That yeah. And then, you know, one of my big guys is of course much later Clive Barker. Like I think to me that queer horror is 20th century and 21st century horror. It's just great. It's just so cool to see how long these things have been around, and like now that they're actually, the discussion is about them, it sends you back to the past and how amazing like the legacy is.
I want to read that. That sounds great. I want to read your thesis. Like that's
somebody,
I know. I'm like, I love it. Can I have that?
Somebody who's a good academic and researcher would have done a great thesis on that topic. Mine is maybe a 4 out of 10, but there's a lot of.
But you know what? That's a 10 out of 10 to what I could probably do. So had you not even told me that, that's great. I mean, I learned something, even just listening to you talk about it now.
Oh, cool. Well, that's great. So it's not that boring. Good.
I'm like,
no, not boring at all.
No, and I'm actually glad you brought up kind of the subject, Ryan, of monstrousness, because that's definitely a thing that I relate to as like a queer woman reader and writer, like that feeling of being the monster. And I do agree that certainly not all monsters in horror novels and horror stories need to be well-developed villains, but I feel like there's something that makes them almost more powerful when they are. Because you know, a faceless monster is a monster, it's the boogeyman, you know, but what happens when that monster looks a little bit like you or has motivations you can understand, you know, behind them? Like that is a subject I'm fascinated by, and I'm wondering, do you look for that as a reader, either of you? Like what are you looking for that in your horror monsters, or if not, what are you looking for as a reader when you turn to horror?
Ooh, I mean, I feel like we can have a lot of these like grand thoughts about what we're delivering, but fundamentally, like above all that, it's just my goal to sensationalize something and create an experience of fear or unsettling for a person, right? Like I think that there's merit in that too, but I know that like when I look at something, if you read any horror, right, like you'll typically see there will be some sort of monster or poltergeist or ghost, but really they tend to be sort of these dark mirrors that we're holding up to ourselves. And a lot of horror actually has to do with what we're willing to do to each other in order to make sure that we make it out, right? Or we get what we want. And so I feel like I include a lot of monsters in my work, but typically, like if at the end of it you were asked to define like who did the most monstrous things, it's other people, sort of operating under high stress, making calls that they feel like are valid but are ultimately, you know, dangerous or hurtful to other people too. That was like a big thing in The Honeys, where I think a lot of people went into that book, and this is my other horror novel that came out last year, where a lot of people went into that book. The book's title is The Honeys. It was marketed as, you know, these mean girls at camp are killing people, and maybe, you know, they're, you know, having a cult or something like that too. And I think a lot of people were surprised when they're the nicest people in the novel. And when they're really inviting, and they're the only people at this summer camp that actually see Mars, the gender fluid main character, as gender fluid. Everyone else sees Mars as a boy, because Mars has to sort of masquerade as a boy in order to get to the camp in the first place, because it's binary, as most summer camps are. But the honeys are like, oh my God, come on in. Like, yeah, here, put on this sports bra. Like, yeah, whatever you're comfortable with. And there's something really validating about that for Mars, the main character, which creates kind of the big debate at the heart of the novel. But I love that. I love playing with the idea that, like, well, this thing's supposed to be the monster, but really what it does is it puts a particular stress on a fissure that's already sort of cracking its way down, this particular femur of society's stability. What if we pushed it all the way? What if it broke? What happens then?
Right.
Awesome.
I mean, I've written so little horror. I'd say like in my YA horror, The Grimmer, monster's definitely just like a scary monster. I think off the page you can think about what it would be like to be this sort of strange creature, sort of like made these deals to sort of hang on to people's souls to this act of cannibalism over the years until he can be resurrected. That's an interesting monster, an interesting life, but you're not going to see much of it in this book because it's so focalized through this kid who only sees that monster as a monster, and the amount of days in the book is so short that we never get to it. In my other horror, Helpmeet, I feel that one is about, people being infinitely cruel and infinitely loving to each other, and then the monster in it is a sort of manifestation of like what the ultimate in love and fusion could be. It's a weird book. It's a very weird book, but that to me is like, it speaks to that other kind of monstrosity you're talking about, the kind that like really has depth and reflects and comes back on us. But I think the best monsters are the ones who are like everything. Like I love like in Dracula, like by Bram Stoker, you have like, he's a monster, but he's like, there's enough interesting stuff about him that you end up getting just generations of different interpretations of him, from like the very romantic Francis Ford Coppola, Bram Stoker's Dracula one, who I love, and then like the Marvel Comics 1970 Dracula, who's just like the meanest, coolest, handsomest guy who's just constantly just killing and ridiculing people, and is so wonderful. Like that to me is like, monsters can be everything. Sometimes they can just be fun and screaming and something to scream at. I like that too.
I love that.
Shout out to the Dracula Daily readers among us today. Speaking of, talk about a novel with some homoerotic subtext at that moment. The OG Bram Stoker, everyone. I would love to ask like a quick craft question of both of you for a moment. Like, when you're approaching writing horror, how do you balance the more like graphic elements in order to like keep the reader in that can't look away state and not push them over into I have to look away, this is too much, which obviously is individual, but I'm curious, like how do you balance the more high key, more graphic, more intense moments so that you keep them there but not, oh God, I'm now running away because this is going to give me nightmares for a month.
I need to think about this. You answer first.
I'm going to give a quick answer. And to me, like, I think the two strategies I've used have been humor, like, which provides like a little bit of distance, not like super ironic, Joss Whedon type, like ironically commenting on everything humor, but that, and also this was actually pointed out to me by my screenwriting partner. It's something in Helpmeet that we're adapting it into a screenplay, and the great thing about having a co-writer is he makes you actually be conscious of the things that you did in a book that you didn't realize. And there's like some extreme body horror and gore in that book. And when we were writing those scenes, he said like, well, obviously these only work and aren't like just total like horror porn, is that you're seeing it through the eyes of like the wife character and like through this extreme compassion. So we need to have that compassion in those scenes. Like, oh yeah, that was not intentional, but it was the way the story took form, and it's what makes, I think, it's what makes that gore justifiable. Like it makes it more intense and actually harder to read, but it also makes it impossible not to read if you've become absorbed in the story.
Oh, I don't know that I even think about this, because I also have gotten the feedback that there's some like very unsettling stuff in either of my horror books, The Honeys and Beholder. But I think it's because I'm fixed upon writing about the things that really scare me. So if there people are sensing breaks, or a threshold, right? Like in the writing of that, it's probably because I reached my limit. And I don't like to look at things too long. And so there's a lot of like stuff in like the honeys that has to do with like little holes, which is a fear of mine. I can't look at things with a bunch of little holes in them, which is an actual fear. It's called trypophobia. And like, while this hasn't, completely changed my life like many phobias do for people, right? Like I still have it and I still get those shivers when I see like a lotus blossom or something like that that has like those like weird pock marks in it. And so I was like, oh, there's something there. There's something with like honeycomb. Like I could use that. Same thing with like Beholder, where there's just moments and sort of a lot of the deaths in Beholder have to do with deaths that if a police officer just looked at them, look like horrific accidents, sort of like Final Destination, but upon a closer inspection, especially if you have any supernatural uncanniness with you, you can sort of start to see that like, oh, there's something else that kind of pulled the wires of this moment in order for it to line up just perfectly so that, this person was crushed or beheaded or something like that too. But I think that also comes out of a lot of my fears that like I'm going to be Final Destination, right? So that's my worst nightmare. I've never gone in a tanning bed since watching those movies, and I don't even want to go in tanning beds. That's never been an interest of mine, but it's like my like biggest fear that I'll get trapped in a tanning bed and paninied like those girls did in that movie. I don't even go in tanning beds, but still looking over my shoulder, still worried about it. And so yeah, I mean, I've lost the plot of this question, but my point being that the notion that like there's gore and body horror, it's usually because I'm trying to work through something myself, but I will totally admit that I've written many scenes that I don't reread. And I'll like edit them, but very minimally. And you're getting sort of my actual brink of my own ability to kind of work through certain things.
That's really interesting. I love that. And you did actually find your way back to the crux of the question. So there you go, professional here.
Yeah.
And I have one or two more questions, but I do want to remind everyone who has joined us tonight, please stick your questions for Ryan and Naben in the chat, and we will get to them here in just a moment. And so, but one of my last questions I had for both of you is, you both mentioned, and looking back at your body of work, you have done lots of different types of writing, like lots of different things. What led you to write horror for young people specifically? Like, because you both kind of, like Ryan, I know you have mainly published in YA, and then this is your first YA, but you both have kind of found your way to YA horror specifically, and I'm just curious kind of what led you in this direction.
To me, like I ended up here just because I love this stuff. Like I'm not as versed in modern YA as I am in the YA of my young adulthood. But I started like reading a bunch of it last year of modern YA, and I realized like, geez, I mean, some of it is indistinguishable from adult horror, I think, which is cool and really, really interesting. But I just found it like so exciting, the idea of like bridging like the things that I really loved reading as a child and as a teenager. And I don't know if it was like this for you or for anybody listening, but I read everything at the same time. Like kind of like my protagonist in this. I was reading like the Hardy Boys and like Kafka's Diaries and Lovecraft, like kind of in the same year, because like those were the things that I found and I'd heard about and like thought were cool and dark. And I just realized like, geez, like I think YA horror is a way that I can sort of take. I wanted to write something like kind of sweet again, like something that had like a lot of decency and kindness in it, which I haven't like it's especially in like my literary fiction. It's those moments are so few, and I wanted to write something that wasn't treacly, that wasn't like sentimental, but had a lot to do with like the kinds of things that I found like appealing in like the work of like Ray Bradbury or like the Stephen King of Stand By Me, like something that was, yes, dark, yes, realistic, yes, about hard things, but also like about people being nice to each other and laughing. And I thought that like, hey, maybe this is the genre where I can kind of do all of that. And I know that's like a very narrow definition of YA horror. It's just the definition of the book I wrote, but yeah, it was a very wide field where I felt like here's a little niche where I could do something that I think is special.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I've always written YA. I think in part because I started writing when I was a teen. My first book was a book that I started when I was being petulant in the library in my high school one day. Um, and I've stuck with it because I really like it. I like the space. I like my readers. But also I like the sense that I can like include messages in what I'm writing, and I can prioritize characters who haven't gotten the screen time, and I can show them doing things that they haven't been allowed to do through someone else's hand, right? Like that's all stuff that I really craved. It's why I started writing in the first place. And now I get to do that. So it's important for me to show queer people going through all sorts of horrors, but also coming out on the other end of it changed and victorious and triumphant. Although I mean, my endings have various degrees of nuance to them that I wouldn't really call triumph in some situations, but yeah, I like it. I don't know. I feel like the more I talk about why I write horror, the less I kind of know. I just feel like it's where my head's at these days. It's what I want to write about. And also, I will say that when you write horror under the umbrella of horror, you can get away with a lot more. There are so many expectations that kind of come with saying, I've written a romance, I've written a fantasy. Those readers want specific things, but a horror reader, like they have my heart because they're in it for the ride and they're willing to accept whatever it takes to kind of get that feeling, right, that you get when you really are confronting something that scares you or makes you think. And there's so many different types of horror, that really it's about the modality of what they deliver, less so about the content of what it takes to get there in the first place. And so I feel like now that I've found my spot in horror, like I'm not giving it up. I love it. I get to do whatever I want, and I get to do it with characters that I've really longed to see on the page for really, for my entire life.
I love that. And so the message I'm hearing is that we all get a little bit of hope as a treat for surviving the horrors.
Yeah.
From both of you.
Sure.
And so we do have a couple of audience questions now. Aiden was wondering, do you prefer horror in one medium over another? So like, I assume this means like screen versus print versus, like all the
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So thank you for chiming in to make sure I'm not completely misconstruing your question.
Yeah.
To me, like the book is the king of all experiences across any genre. Like the thing that I like the most is literary fiction of any genre. Like to me, that like encompasses a lot of stuff. But when you ask about horror in particular, that really complicates it for me because there are some like, I think I probably like Hellraiser, Clive Barker's movie, better than Clive Barker's book, The Hellbound Heart. Like I don't think I like anything better than Hellraiser. There's things about the visual experience of horror that I think result in some of the most unique, incredible artworks, and that for me personally, but would I say that I like even my favorite horror movies better than my favorite horror novels or short stories? No, but it's the one genre where it's a real battle for me, like as to what I prefer.
I think I love horror movies. I love the experience of being in a big theater of a bunch of people watching and screaming at whatever is like happening. Like that's unmatched to me, but totally different than, actually sitting and reading a book or something like that, where like it's really penetrating way past just the sensation of watching something into like your mind. I feel like they're so different. But I'll admit that like I don't read that often. And that's in part because I just don't have the time or like the brain power to kind of sit and do it like I used to. But I feel like most of the horror that I take in these days is either a movie that I'm watching in theaters, which is my favorite, or I've been really appreciative of the new sort of like rise of like horror TV shows like Haunting at Hill House, American Horror Story, things that are sort of in that realm and that tradition. It's been great to see stories told over an entire season. And I think that that's great. I hope that never goes away.
I don't know if you watch that show Slasher, but the showrunner Ian Carpenter has that same phobia you do of like the tiny holes. I don't know if it's actually, yeah, but I talked to him once and he talked about how that was like a big thing for him. Yeah.
I love that. That's great. Yeah, you'd never know. People have all sorts of weird fears.
Yeah.
People have all sorts of weird everything.
Mm-hmm.
So Aiden did have another question for us. what book or character do you consider horror that others might not? Maybe a book that's usually categorized in another genre, but that for you, you consider it horror.
I have a
Ooh,
good answer for this.
question.
I'll go second though.
Mine is like an obscure answer, but it would be this. It's The Far Cry by Frederick Brown, which is usually looked at as a crime novel. Frederick Brown is he was like a pulp writer, but he wrote the one episode of Star Trek that became the episode Arena, like Captain Kirk era Star Trek, where it's Captain Kirk versus like a big poorly made lizard monster. But the premise is like that this alien race, this super intelligent alien race, has realized that there's going to be a war between these two other races, humans and the Gorns. And if this war happens, both races will be entirely wiped out. So instead of that, they just choose they just choose one person from each race and like say, like, you guys have a fight, and whoever wins, we're not going to wipe out your race. We'll wipe out the entire other race. Like that's probably what Frederick Brown's most famous story. But he wrote this really like quiet horror story about bad relationships, I think it is. But it's just about like a guy who's trying to track down this vanished woman, and the only clues are like she was living with this artist who later went to an asylum and died there, but he left behind a bunch of paintings that might be clues. And he started going through these paintings and seeing what they can tell him, and living in the same place where this artist and the vanished woman lived. And as he comes to know more and more about her, basically things in his own life become clear to him that end like the last couple of pages of that are a complete nightmare. It's a weird, you can tell he wrote it in 2 weeks, but it's still somehow a really good book.
Those sound good. I'm writing these down.
I know, right? I'm like,
my answer to this, and this is like the one question that I like think about all the time, and I will not rest until I have made this the predominant opinion, but the rainbow fish. You remember the rainbow fish?
I don't.
The
I love that
child's
you're
book where it's
reaching
like a
for this.
fish.
I'm gonna
it's like
turn
a
my
fish.
video on for that one.
Yes. I hate the rainbow fish. This book is for like 2-year-olds, and it's about like a fish that has glittering scales, and everyone hates this fish because of the glittering scales and also its vein. And so what does it do? But it goes in it. The whole book is supposed to be a lesson about like sharing your shine, and it basically an octopus scolds it and it says, why don't you share it, or else then you'll have friends. And so this fish then distributes its glimmering scales to all the other fish, and so by the end of it, all the fish have like one little glittering scale. But as a kid who knew a lot about fish, and knowing that you can't just rip off a part of your body and give it to somebody else, I was terrified of this novel, and I was so horrified that everyone in this novel was telling this like one fish, which I definitely thought was gay, that like, oh, its pathway to acceptance was to literally like peel off bits of its body and distribute it to like a community that was then going to wear its body like a trophy, and like that's what acceptance looked like. I hated that book as a kid, and I hate it even more now because now I know why.
Oh
That's
my God,
great.
that's amazing.
You should write a riff on that as like a kid's book, and it'd be your go
The
the fuck.
rainbow fish, but we won't edit the blood out of the water.
No. And I mean, the rainbow fish, if we're coming from I have a biology background, I'm always like, and now they all glitter, and the rainbow fish doomed them all to death from predation because they're all
Yes.
visible now. So
Yeah.
you feel free to, include that in your horror take on rainbow fish, please.
And
Go ahead.
truly, and like if you even read it now, and I know this because there are like now kids in my life that are like being read this book, like the rainbow fish gets the exact wrong advice moments before. Like an octopus is like, why don't you share this? And then a second later, even though the octopus lives out on this reef far away from everybody else, like the rainbow fish like swims out to go talk to the wise octopus, suddenly, oh my God, there it is, there's the rainbow fish. Suddenly the little fish that like is in like scene 1 is like suddenly there, and it's a setup. Like the fish is like, oh, rainbow fish, like I would like one of your scales, and the rainbow fish, having just gotten this terrible advice, is like, I guess, and gives it a scale, and the fish goes and tells every other fish, and they all swarm it and peel off its scales. It's like, I don't know, I'm like, this is Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, but it's going to be my version of it.
Love it. Pretty good.
Oh God, that's amazing.
Here we have our haunted little girl. She got close enough finally that I could grab her. Hi, say hi, sweetie.
Captured. Great cat, nice coat, very good cat.
Oof, we love a good
She's
cat
very
cam.
angry right now. Do you want to stretch? Sometimes we stretch, and she, but we don't want to do that right now. Hi, I know I caught you. You were so upset. Were there other questions?
Yes, I would say, does anybody have another question that they would like to ask real quick before we go? Anyone at all? And thank you for one of the better questions of the evening, just because it got us the rainbow fish diatribe, which is. Well, I do want to thank you both so much for coming and joining us this evening. It was a lot of fun. It's always fun, especially around. I am very basic in my reading, whereas if it's October and we're getting close to Halloween, I'm sorry, we're now circling back around to horror again. So this was the perfect time to be able to bring you both in and have this wonderful conversation. Thank you to Ben. Thank you, Ryan, so much. And everybody who joined us tonight, thank you for coming and joining us. Be reminded that you can find the links to purchase both the Grimmer and Beholder in the chat. They are, if you scroll up a little bit up from the questions, you will see both links there, as well as the link to next week's horror event, Elements of Horror, with Dathan Auerbach and Valerie Neiman. So we do hope you join us for that online event as well. The registration link event is there in the chat for you. So thank you both so much for coming out. And yeah, we hope we can have you back sometime again soon.
Love that. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks.